Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving deep into a story that I think has really captured a lot of people's imaginations over the years. Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Two cities that even today, thousands of years later, still kind of have this hold on our collective imagination.
Absolutely.
And so I'm really glad to be talking to you today to kind of get into the nitty-gritty
Yeah.
of what this story is really about. We've had a lot of interest from our listeners about really exploring this story, the history behind it, the impact it's had throughout history. And I'm excited to get your take on all this.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I think it's a story that continues to kind of fascinate and maybe even disturb people.
Right.
And I think when we look at the historical context and really dive into what the text actually says about Sodom and Gomorrah, it can help us understand why.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get us started, why don't we go back to the beginning of the story?
Yeah.
You've got Abram, who later becomes Abraham,
Ah.
and his nephew Lot. And their households had grown so large and wealthy that they actually needed to split up. And this is how Lot ends up settling near Sodom.
Yeah, that's right. It's in Genesis 13. And I think what's interesting is that the text already tells us about Sodom's reputation at this point. The men of the city were known for their wickedness. So there's this sense of foreshadowing right from the beginning.
Oh, wow. So even back then, there were already these warning signs. But Lot still chooses to settle nearby.
He did, and it's a decision that has puzzled a lot of readers over the years. But I think it's important to remember that while Lot chose to live near Sodom, he was considered a righteous man. The book of 2 Peter describes him as tormented by the wickedness he saw all around him.
So even though he was living there, he wasn't necessarily participating in everything.
Exactly. He was trying to maintain his own principles despite being surrounded by so much corruption. And that actually becomes important later in the story.
Okay, interesting. So Lot's in Sodom. What happens next? I mean, this is where things start to get really intense, right? God decides he's going to destroy the cities because of their sin.
Yeah. In Genesis 18, we see God revealing his intentions to Abraham. And what's fascinating is that God doesn't just suddenly decide to wipe them out. The text talks about this outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, suggesting that their wickedness wasn't a one-time thing. It was something that had been going on for a long time.
So God was aware of their sin and was giving them time.
It seems that way. And, Abraham actually pleads with God to spare the cities. He challenges God, asks if he would destroy the righteous along with the wicked. It shows us God's mercy, his willingness to listen and potentially relent.
It sounds like Abraham was a pretty good negotiator. But ultimately, God does decide to go through with the destruction. And that's where we get to the part of the story that I think most people remember, the angels arriving in Sodom.
Right. 2 angels arrive in Genesis 19, and Lot, being the hospitable guy that he is, invites them into his home instead of letting them stay in the town square.
It seems like a kind gesture, but I have a feeling this is where things go really wrong.
Yeah, you're right. This is where we see the true depths of Sodom's depravity. All the men of the city, from young to old, surround Lot's house and demand to have homosexual relations with the angels.
Oh, that's pretty disturbing.
It is. It's a shocking display of immorality, and actually where we get the term sodomy from. The text doesn't shy away from describing the utter corruption that had taken hold in the city.
Wow. Yeah, I can see why this story's had such a lasting impact. So Lot is trapped in his house with all these men outside, demanding these awful things. What happens next?
Well, Lot, in a desperate attempt to protect his guests, offers his own daughters to the mob. It shows how far gone the city was. They had abandoned any sense of basic human decency.
That's just horrible. That's hard to even imagine, that level of moral corruption. But the angels are there. They must intervene, right?
They do. They realize how serious the situation is, and they strike the men outside with blindness. It's this powerful image of God protecting his messengers, even in the midst of all this chaos. And it sets the stage for Lot and his family to escape.
Okay, so they get out just in time. It must have been a terrifying experience. But I remember something about Lot's wife. Didn't she look back?
She did. As they're fleeing, the angels warn them not to look back at the city. But Lot's wife can't resist the temptation, disobeys, and is turned into a pillar of salt. It's a chilling detail, one that raises a lot of questions.
Yeah, I can see why. What do you think it means? Was it just about physically turning around, or is there something deeper going on there?
That's a great question, and one we should definitely unpack. But maybe we should save that for part 2 of our deep dives after a short break.
So we were talking about Lot's wife and her disobedience before the break. What do you think her story is meant to teach us? It seems like such a small action just looking back, but it had such drastic consequences.
It's an interesting detail for sure, and it's been interpreted in so many different ways. Some see it as a warning against longing for the past, even a past filled with sin. Others see it as a symbol of disobedience, the importance of trusting God's instructions, even when we don't fully understand them.
Yeah, I can see that. Even though she was physically escaping, it's like a part of her was still attached to that city, to her old life, and it cost her everything.
Right, and it raises this question, what does it really mean to escape from something? Is it just about physical distance, or is there also this internal transformation that needs to happen?
Yeah, it makes you think about what Sodom might represent in our own lives. Obviously, we're not facing fire and brimstone,
Hmm.
but are there things we're clinging to that we need to let go of? Maybe bad habits, relationships, or even ways of thinking that are ultimately destructive.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons this story is still so powerful today. It reminds us that we can't just run away from our problems or pretend they don't exist. Real change requires a change of heart, a willingness to turn away from whatever's holding us back.
And that can be so hard,
Yeah.
especially when it's something familiar, something we've gotten used to, like Lot's wife. Maybe she looked back because there was some sense of comfort in what she knew, even if it was ultimately harmful.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Change can be scary, even when we know it's for the best. And I think that's where Lot's story as a whole becomes really relevant. He chose to live near Sodom. He knew the dangers, but he was drawn to it somehow. Maybe it was the prosperity, the comfort, the sense of belonging.
So he compromised even though he knew better, and it had these devastating consequences for his family.
Exactly. And that's something I think we can all relate to. Maybe not on such a dramatic scale, but we all face those moments where we have to choose between what's easy and what's right, between fitting in and standing up for what we believe in.
It's that age-old struggle, right?
Mm.
Between doing what we know we should and giving in to temptation.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And Sodom and Gomorrah reminds us that those choices have consequences. We can't just flirt with darkness without being affected by it. It seeps into our lives, erodes our values, ultimately leads to destruction.
But the text also tells us that Sodom's sins went beyond just sexual immorality. They were also known for their pride, their selfishness, neglect of the poor and vulnerable.
That's an important point. It wasn't just that they made bad choices. Sodom was a society that had lost its moral compass completely. They were consumed by their own desires, indifferent to the suffering of others, and totally disconnected from any sense of justice or compassion.
It really sounds like a cautionary tale, not just about individual sin, but about what happens when a whole society loses its way.
Precisely. I think that's why it's so important to think about this story. In the context of our own lives and the world around us, are we as individuals and as a society moving closer to God or further away? Are we embracing values that lead to life? Or are we falling into these patterns of behavior that ultimately bring destruction?
Wow, those are some big questions. It makes me wonder, what does it even mean to pursue righteousness in a world that often feels so Sodom-like sometimes?
It's a tough question for sure, one that we need to grapple with. But I think there's hope too, even in the midst of all the darkness. We see glimpses of God's mercy and his desire to save. We see it in Abraham's intercession, in Lot's struggle to maintain his integrity, and in the escape of Lot and his daughters.
So even in the midst of judgment, there's this message of hope, of redemption.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this story so powerful, so relevant for us today. It reminds us that even when things seem hopeless, God is still at work. He's still offering us a way out, a path toward healing and restoration, but it's up to us to choose it.
So that choice, that commitment to turning away from Sodom
Yeah.
and pursuing righteousness, that's where the real challenge lies.
It is, but it's also where the greatest rewards are found. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah doesn't just warn us about the dangers of sin, it also points us toward the beauty of redemption, the power of choosing a different path.
It's not just a story of destruction, but also a story of hope.
Exactly. It's a story that invites us to examine our own lives, to confront our own Sodom moments, and to choose, with God's help, a path that leads to life, to wholeness, to a future filled with purpose and meaning.
That's a really inspiring way to look at it. But how do we actually do that? What does it look like to pursue righteousness in a practical sense in a world that often feels so hostile to those values?
Yeah. That's a great question, and one that we should definitely explore further. But I think we need to save that conversation for the final part of our deep dive.
We've been talking about Sodom and Gomorrah and all the lessons it has for us today. And before we kind of left off, We were talking about this hope that's woven throughout this story, even with all the destruction and judgment. But it left me wondering, what does it actually look like to pursue righteousness in a world that can often feel like its own kind of Sodom?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the story itself gives us some clues. Remember, even though Abraham wasn't living in Sodom, he was still deeply concerned about its people. He pleaded with God to spare the cities, if even a few righteous people could be found there.
That's right. He was
But
willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was unpopular. So it sounds like pursuing righteousness. It isn't just about our individual actions, but also about our concern for others, our willingness to speak up for people who are marginalized or oppressed.
Absolutely. It's about embodying those values that Sodom had totally abandoned. Compassion, justice, a commitment to the well-being of all people, not just
So
ourselves.
it's about being a light in the darkness, even when it feels like the darkness is winning.
Exactly. And that's where I think the example of Lot comes in. He was living in Sodom, surrounded by all this corruption, but he was still trying to hold on to his own principles. He didn't always get it right, and he made mistakes, but he never fully gave up on doing what he believed was right.
It reminds me of that verse in 2 Peter. It says, "He rescued righteous Lot, who was greatly distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless." It sounds like even in the middle of all that darkness, Lot was still considered righteous because of his heart, his desire to be different.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's a really encouraging message for all of us. We don't have to be perfect to be considered righteous. What matters is our heart, our willingness to keep striving, keep growing, keep moving towards the light, even when we stumble along the way.
So it's not about being perfect, but about being intentional, about actively choosing a different path.
Yes. And I think that's where the story of Lot's wife is so important. Her sin wasn't just that she physically looked back, but that her heart was still in Sodom. She wasn't fully committed to leaving that old life behind.
So true freedom isn't just about escaping physically, but also about this internal transformation, letting go of the things that are holding us back.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those Sodom moments in our own lives and making a conscious choice to turn away from them. It might be a harmful habit, a toxic relationship, or even just a way of thinking that's keeping us from experiencing the fullness of life that God wants for us.
It sounds like pursuing righteousness is a journey, not a destination.
Absolutely. It's about continually striving to align our lives with God's will, to become more like Christ, to reflect his love and grace in the world.
So it's not just about avoiding sin, but about actively working to make the world a better place.
Yes. It's about bringing hope to the hopeless, comforting the hurting, and speaking out against injustice.
That's powerful. It makes me think about all those small acts of kindness, those moments of compassion, those times when we choose to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Those are all ways of bringing light into the darkness, of pushing back against the Sodom in our world.
I think so. And those seemingly small actions, they can have a ripple effect and inspire others to do the same. We may never know the full impact of our choices, but we can trust that God is working through them to bring about his purposes.
So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's a sobering reminder of the consequences of sin, but it also offers us hope, a call to action. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, we have a choice. We can be part of the problem, or we can be part of the solution.
And that's a choice worth making. It's a choice that brings meaning and purpose to our lives and ultimately makes a difference in the world.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. This has given me
Yes.
a lot to think about.
It's been my pleasure.
And for all of you listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Sodom and Gomorrah. We hope it's challenged you to think about what Sodom might look like in your own life and to choose to pursue righteousness, a path that leads to life, hope, and a better future for all of us. Until next time.